Welcome to Women and Resistance, a powerful podcast where we honor the courage, resilience, and revolutionary spirits of women across the globe. Hosted by Ayafubere Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, we uncover untold stories of defiance against systemic oppression, whether colonialism, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. From historic icons like Winnie Mandela and Fannie Lou Hamer to today's trailblazers, we shine a light upon those shaping a more just world. This is a call to honor the past, embrace the present, and build an empowered future. Yes, greetings, and welcome to another episode of Women and Resistance, your podcast where we highlight the role women have played in our continued liberation. And this week, my name is Adesoji Iginla. I'm your host, and co-host with me before she embodies our guest for today is Ayafubere Eneli Esquire. Today, we're going into the heartland of the United States. And where to start then during 1913. Essentially, human being comes into money, but the state does what the state normally does, which is, hold on, you can't possibly manage that money yourself. So we're going to make you a ward of the state. That ward of the state is here to explain how that came to be and what transpired thereafter. So today we are showcasing Sarah Rector. Welcome, ma'am.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, at some point in the history of the United States, you were deemed, let's use the language of the time, the richest colored girl in the world. Wow, how time flies. What that means and how you came to have that moniker, could you please give us a brief introduction of yourself first and foremost, then we'll get into knowing you better in the course of the 1 hour with you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to tell my story. It's been told by many people. There was recently a movie supposedly about my life, but as Hollywood is wont to do, quite a few embellishments. There was a dog named Blue. There was, of course, a white savior and some other myths. So this is a very welcome opportunity to tell my own story.
Okay.
The richest colored girl in the world. Before people even knew my name, for the few who did know my name, what they did know was a number, $300 back in 1913. That was the number that the Kansas City Star, the newspaper, put in ink on September 1913. And once that number got out into the world, it essentially dehumanized me because it was no longer about me as a person.
About your worth.
It was a story that belonged to everybody. In fact, Antonia Bolden, who wrote a book about me, I'll hold that book up for you here, which, by the way, features a picture of a beautiful black girl who is purported to be me, and that is not me. But it is a picture that has made the rounds as Sarah Rector. But as she covers in this book, and she has newspaper articles, and she did a great job of researching my earlier years.
Okay.
Once that number got out, it elicited a very interesting response from the public. Strangers writing letters asking me to marry them. Of course, they weren't marrying me or trying to marry me. They were trying to marry a number. Men who never touched Oklahoma dirt, but decided nonetheless that they were entitled to a piece of what was mine. And even white women who would write with their tales of woe and make a case for why I, as a colored girl, should not have all that money, and that money should be distributed to help address their financial woes. Of course, they were then historians and school teachers, people I never met. all of them holding this number up to the light, trying to decide what it means. I was born on March 3rd, 1902.
Okay.
And I was born in a cabin that had 2 rooms and a dirt yard on a creek land near a little settlement some called Twine, and others later folded into the all-black town of Taft. You would have to do a little bit more research and digging to get more into the story of the so-called 5 civilized Indian tribes and their ownership of enslaved Africans, even though it was a minute percentage that owned enslaved Africans. The historians put it at about 2%, but nonetheless, there were indigenous Americans, also known as Indians, who owned Africans. My father was Joseph Rector. My mother was Rose. Most people knew her as Mama Rose. And she earned that name the hard way, raising 9 children and eventually bearing a husband and holding a family together through more than what any one woman should have to hold. Although that is a story that is not uncommon within what is now called the African American community. Of course, we've been called colored people. We've been called Negroes. Those are the more, in quotes, civilized terms. My people did not arrive in Indian territory as strangers to bondage, as I earlier stated. My grandparents had been enslaved, not by white colonizers in Georgia or Mississippi, but by Creek Indians, and specifically members of the Muskogee Nation, who were part of the so-called civilized 5 tribes. And these are tribes that held people of African descent in slavery before the Civil War. Now, this is a part of history that most people would rather smooth over because we like little neat romanticized stories. But the story of Indians or even other people of African descent owning slaves complicates the story that we may want to tell about Native nations or tell about slavery and this notion of what we now call capitalism. So I was born from that complication. The Muskogee Creek Nation fought on the Confederate side in parts of that war. And again, while some might want to idealize the U.S. Civil War and argue that it was about states' rights, in their own documents, the Confederate states admit that the fight was over the continued enslavement of people of African descent. And this is a side that the Muskogee Creek Nation chose to fight on. Now, you have to again go back into the history to understand that this land, most of the land that is now known as the United States of America, belonged to the native people, to the indigenous people. You may have heard of the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
And someone who is now touted by the current president as his idol, Andrew Jackson. You may have heard of the forced removal of indigenous people from their land, from their fertile lands, and the forced movement of them into areas that were not at that time desired by the colonizers, the planters. So there was a treaty that was formed and a promise explicitly made by Andrew Jackson that once these Native American nations moved to this godforsaken, what they considered godforsaken land territory, which at that time was a little over 300 million acres, that the United States of America will forever leave them alone and will respect the treaty. You don't need me to tell you that that was a lie. One of many lies that any group that has attempted to form an agreement with the United States of America has come to find that many times those agreements are not even worth the paper that they're written on. Well, when the United States Civil War was done, and of course the Confederacy had lost, the United States government now forced a new treaty on the Creek Nation in 1866. That treaty, in addition to reducing the amount of land that was now Indian territory, also indicated that the people the Creeks had once enslaved, who were known as the Creek Freedmen, my grandparents among them, would become citizens of the nation itself, with rights to the land the same as those with Creek blood. That promise mattered more than most Americans today perhaps understand. Essentially, what it meant is that when the federal government broke up the communal lands of Indian territory, so just like I've read in Africa, the land was owned communally by the people. So one person or one family could not decide that this is my land and therefore I can sell it. But what the federal government of the United States did was they broke up the communal lands of Indian territory under what was called the Dawes Allotment Act. And then they prepared Oklahoma for statehood. And Creek freedmen and their children like me, were entitled as well to an allotment of land. Not my father's land, but an allotment in my own name. Okay. Not my mother's, but mine. And my allotment was 160 acres. And this allotment was located in Glenpool, about 60 miles or so from the cabin where I was born. I had never laid eyes on that land. In 1907, that land was considered virtually worthless. It was rocky. It was scrubby. It was bad for planting. You take the choicest lands of the people and then you basically throw them to the wolves, essentially. Now, the government's own appraisers valued my allotment, 160 acres, around $550. It was at that time barely enough to matter to a family. We didn't have much, and we had many mouths to feed. And then you also had the issue of tax, because there was a $30 a year property tax on ground that you could not farm and that you could not do much with to make a living, eke out a living, to even pay the taxes on the property. So for people who want to turn my story into a fairy tale, you should know this.
Details.
For 4 years, my land was a burden. It was not a blessing. In fact, over the years, my father sold the allotments of some of my siblings. And in February of 1911, my father leased my allotment to an oil company just to keep the tax collector off of our backs.
Okay.
Nobody in my family had any notion, least of all me, that there was a fortune sleeping under the rock. So when you watch the movie and they say my faith had me convinced that there was wealth in this land, that is a complete fabrication. There was no way for me to know. And no, I did not have any faith in land I had not even seen. In other words, this land was worthless by the standards that mattered to white Oklahoma. Until it wasn't. And at the moment
it wasn't,
it stopped being worthless. My life stopped being my own to control or to narrate. You should know that when Oklahoma became a state, the very first order for their legislature was to institutionalize segregation.
Okay.
These were not wonderful times for Black people, whether we were Creek Freedmen with land allotments or not. Well, in the spring of 1913, I was all of 11 years old, and an independent driller named B.B. Jones, well, he brought in a well on my land that the men on the crew called a gusher, 2,500 barrels a day. They said better than 100,000 gallons of oil was pouring up out of the ground that the government had once priced at $550. Do you know that my allotment, it turned out, sat in the middle of what would become the rich Glenpool and the Cushing Drumright oil fields. And it was some of the most productive ground in the entire mid-continent oil boom. Again, according to the papers, by that fall, this 11-year-old Negro, colored girl, was earning more than $300 a day. In October of 1913, I don't believe any of you were born at that time. My royalties just in that month came to $11,567 in 1 month. This was at a time when American households, whether Black, whether white, any color, were fortunate if in the span of a whole month they made $60. Kansas City Star ran the headline, "Millions to a Negro girl." Then the Savannah Tribune ran its own version. Negro girls, $112,000 a year. One paper, because, racism
Rife at that time.
is as embedded and as part of the American fabric as anything else, including the Declaration of Independence. This paper called me the richest Negro in the world. I didn't choose the headline. I did not choose the sentence structure that made Negro do the work of astonishment. How dare a Negro girl be worth anything?
Wow.
And here I was, 11 years old, still living in a cabin in Indian Territory. And America had decided that my existence was a novelty act. But here's where the papers really got their senses titillated. I could not, under the law of my own state, manage a single dollar of that money. Oklahoma law, like the laws of most of the country in those years, did not extend to Black families the same rights as white families, those rights that white families took for granted. The right of parents to simply be the legal guardians of their own children's affairs. And as many newspapers would write, of course, my parents were ignorant. Any parents of any rich Black child were, of course, ignorant. Really too stupid, too immature, incapable of handling their own wealth. My parents were alive, and very much my parents and active in my life, and they loved me. And by every account, they were careful, sober, and responsible people. Nonetheless, toiling under segregation and discrimination and being marginalized over and over again. But it didn't matter how responsible my parents were, because the law required a court-appointed guardian for a minor holding significant property. And the practice of the time all but guaranteed that guardian would be white. There were Black guardians. In fact, there were some attorneys
Who could be guardian?
of the, what was called the Negro race at the time, who were guardians. And
Okay.
unfortunately, some of them were also fined for misappropriating the funds and resources of their wards. My parents chose a man named Thomas Jefferson Porter T.J. Porter. He was a white man who had been, as my parents said, a friend to the family for 8 years, long before my land was found to have any value. In fact, there was a time when the Negro organizations got involved in trying to find me because they were children of African descent, Black, Negro, all the terms. I'm using them interchangeably, who were blown up. It's a story, many stories. Dynamite planted under their home, blown up so that someone else could get at their allotment.
Wow.
Children were kidnapped, never to be seen again. And so at one point, Booker T. Washington took an interest in me, or at least in my wealth and where I was. So did W.E.B. Du Bois. In fact, he wrote a letter to the judge who was overseeing the guardianships at the time and wanted to know who my guardian was. And much to his surprise, after he found out that it was T.J. Porter, a white man, and he inquired as to why that white man had been put over me as a guardian, I know he was very surprised to find out that my parents had pointed to this white man and had approved of his guardianship over me.
Why so? Why was he surprised?
Well, because at that time there were so many stories of white guardians who were grifting off of their Black and Indian wards, because this was not only happening to Black children who had allotments, it was also happening to Indian children who had allotments. And so these white men were just stealing from them left, right, in all ways.
Mm.
And so I would suppose the prevailing thought would be find a reputable Black person and not willingly give guardianship over to a white person.
Yeah. Okay.
But as far as I was told, Porter was of good character, and he was not one of those white men who was stealing and grifting off of Black and Indian children. And I would say that T.J. Porter's character was probably the main thing standing between my wealth, my family's well-being, and total ruin.
Mm.
So here's the thing in America that I experienced. Once a Black person, a Black child in particular, has some fame or fortune,
okay,
it's as though the country cannot decide whether to rob or rescue the person. I think a lot of times, even if they may have started out as rescuing, eventually if that Black person gets too big for their britches, then there must be a way to cut them back down to size. Some papers wrote that I was a white child held captive and passed off as Black to steal
the wealth,
my inheritance. Because somehow my own existence itself had to be challenged. Wealth and Blackness could not go together. The Chicago Defender actually wrote a story at one point stating that I was living in rags, I was illiterate, I was starving, while my white guardian grew fat off my oil. That was true for some others, but it was not my story. What I saw over and over again up until my 20s, when I had to fight to prove that I was capable of handling my own affairs, was this notion of white greed dressed up as concern. When W.E.B. Du Bois initially heard about T.J. Porter, he actually sent a special agent, a man named James C. Waters Jr., He sent him down to Oklahoma to look into my case on behalf of the NAACP. And the NAACP at the time created a children's department specifically to look out for the interests of children of color. Of course, it was the Association of Colored People, to ensure that we were not being robbed. A Black Oklahoman paper, it was called the Muskogee Sign-Meter, had printed a line about Judge Leahy, who was the judge overseeing these guardianships,
Okay.
that I have always liked better than anything the white paper has ever said about me. And the line was this: it takes an awful big man to give the Negro a square deal. And Muscogee's judge is such a man. Judge Leahy really did look out for me. Now, I tell you, once my name and my number were made public, I was prime meat thrown before a pack of hungry lions. Letters from white men who made no secret that what they wanted was not a wife, but a hand on my oil money. The Oklahoma legislature, in one of the strangest gestures anybody ever made in my direction, considered declaring me honorary white. Why? So I could ride in first-class train cars, as if the solution to
Segregation.
the racism and segregation we contended with daily and all the indignities, that the way to address that was to carve out an exception for one girl. So I suppose I ride in the first class and my family rides.
You are listening to Women and Resistance with Aya Fubera Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, where we honor the voices of women who have shaped history through courage and defiance. If you're finding these stories inspiring, take a moment to subscribe, share, and support this platform. Together, we amplify the voices that deserve to be heard. Now, back to the conversation. In coaching.
With the mules. Even as I say this today, I think of how proud some of you may be when you get on the planes or the fancy trains and others have to go to the poorer section while you strut to the first class, but you're still black. It was a workaround that the legislature wanted that did not address the system, did not address the systemic issues, but would be a carve-out because I was rich. And how many rich, and I will call them Negroes today, think they are exceptional because of their wealth, that they are perhaps honorary white? I did not go to some of the fancy schools that some felt that I should go to. My parents felt I was young and they wanted to keep me relatively close. But I did eventually go to Tuskegee, to the children's school that Booker T. Washington himself had arranged. And a group of men followed me there, intending to hold me for ransom. They were going to kidnap me. What saved me was a guard of students watching precisely for that kind of danger. And they are the ones who foiled my kidnapping. Can you for a second put yourself in my shoes at the time? Here I was, a child, and grown men were calculating what I was worth and laying in wait to kidnap me for a ransom. Well, eventually the court did approve. The court had to approve every bit of allotment of money from my earnings.
Yeah.
And eventually we did buy land and built a 5-room cottage. When we talk about a 5-room cottage, do not mistake it for how homes in the U.S. now are advertised. If they say a 5-room house, that is 5 bedrooms plus other spaces. So it would include your kitchen and maybe a living room and, all of those things. No. A 5-room cottage meant just that. When you added all of the rooms, the spaces in the house,
even the pantry,
it was 5. But of course, I also eventually had access to more money than most of white America would ever see. as I thought about what I wanted to share with you today, because I wonder how many of you had heard of me and what you heard about me. In a sense, there are two very different, I would say maybe not very, but they're two different historical figures. The girl who lived and then the legend that was built on top of her. And that girl who lived became the woman I am. I'm sure some of you came and you had me stuck as this beautiful child whom I don't know. Or you had me stuck in the 1930s with a very different kind of outward look. But I lived till 1967, relatively modern. And that is the story that most don't know. And I will not go into great detail because I still like to keep some things private. Now, for most of the 20th century, though, I barely existed in what would be called the historical record. Yes, if you went and looked up old newspapers in the area of Oklahoma where my land was, and then, of course, in Black newspapers and NAACP files. But I wasn't in textbooks. Tonya Bolden, who published a biography on me in 2014 called Searching for Sarah Rector, the richest Black girl in America. That's an upgrade from Negro. Was initially really the only reliable compilation
record
of my life. Of course, since then, my own family have written a book as well. And that book goes into a little bit more detail of
your childhood,
my life, and gets beyond some of the legend. And that book is titled A Name Worth Millions, the story of Sarah Rector and her family. And my own nieces wrote that book, correcting some of the misinformation that has been out there. So when you invited me to Women and Resistance, and I must congratulate you for the work you're doing, I had to think and say, do I fit with these women that you've highlighted? Women who chose to be activists, women who chose to take on careers that, that they had been, excluded from. Women who took very courageous stands. Do I qualify to be in their midst? And I would humbly say, yeah, because after years of, first it was T.J. Porter, and then eventually my guardianship was moved to Mr. Young, and then there was another gentleman who actually did try to steal money, and then he was removed from being guardian, and then someone else. I mean, after all of that, in 1922, I went to the court and I said, I am of age and I can manage my own affairs. I do not need a guardian, white or otherwise. Now, I know some of you with children may consider that rather foolhardy in one sense, being that today 20-year-olds are not what we were back in my time, and whether I really did have the ability, but I still resisted the common way of discarding Black people back then and insisted on my own agency. And if I had to hire advisors, then let it be me choosing and let it be me deciding what I want to do with my money instead of having to come to the court every time I wanted to buy anything of value. Imagine being so-called the richest girl. And if I needed a dress, if I wanted to do anything, it had to go through my guardian and then present it to the court, and then the court would grant or deny the request. My story went quiet in mainstream memory for a long time. And when it eventually started to percolate again, it was some internet articles, some social media posts. We didn't have social media when I was alive. And of course, eventually, the film the movie that recently came out with all of its fabrications. This photograph that I've shown you now was used in headlines and memes, even though my own descendants have said that's not me. Of course, there have been claims that I died penniless, that I was literally enslaved, that I was kidnapped, that my parents abandoned me to my guardian and fled Oklahoma entirely. That's not true. After Tuskegee, my family moved to Kansas City. My family never left me. My family never abandoned me. So after we relocated to Kansas City, Missouri, and out of Oklahoma entirely, we moved into this cultural space that was thriving. It was a thriving Black cultural and its space. And there were thriving Black businesses as well, particularly in the area of 18th and Vine. And we settled not too far from there. By then, on paper, I was a millionaire. I owned stocks and bonds. I owned a boarding house. I owned a bakery. I owned land in more than one state. And I graduated from Lincoln High School in Kansas City. And after much haggling, a judge examined me formally on the record and found me mentally sound and entirely capable of managing my own affairs. White people didn't have to jump through those kind of hoops. The court had to certify that I was capable of running my own life. And imagine the courts where that sort of certification was not forthcoming for many other Black people. I married for the first time in 1920 to a Kansas City businessman named Kenneth Campbell. Now, you might be imagining a grand, elaborate affair, and that is so far from the truth. I wanted a small, private wedding. My mother was there because my father had passed away. My grandmother was there, some of his close family members, but it was not a big gathering. So while much of my childhood since oil had been found, this gusher had played out in public, I wanted my wedding to be private. Me and Kenneth, we had 3 sons. Kenneth Jr., Leonard, and Clarence. Good names. You all don't call your children Clarence anymore. It's a good name. And together, we built the kind of life that the newspapers had never bothered to imagine for me. We did build a large home on East 12th Street, and it was known as the Rector Mansion. We did have a Rolls Royce with a driver, and we threw all kinds of parties in this thriving Kansas City, parties that the likes of Duke Ellington and Count Basie, who would come to perform, might turn up at. Because at that time, Kansas City in Missouri was one of the great jazz cities in the world. And of course, my husband and I were naturally part of the Black elite. However, my marriage to Kenneth ended in 1930. I was 28 years old. And he moved on to Chicago and later became a councilman. He was an elected official in Chicago. And I would marry again in 1934. To William Crawford, who owned a restaurant. And I helped him open a second restaurant in Tulsa with my money, entirely by my own choice without having to ask for permission. I was building something with a man I also chose for myself. Now, as I wrap up our time together, I know that they are probably asking this question. Well, what happened to the money? Someone says I was Creek Indian. I was Creek Freedmen. That's what I and my family say. Well, what happened to the money was what happened to the money of a great many wealthy families across the United States. The Great Depression did to my fortune what it did to the fortunes of so many others. It gutted it. Stock values that once had made me one of the wealthiest women, those stock values were nothing. It was just what it was. Real estate I had counted on lost most of its worth, and I eventually sold that mansion on 12th Street. But would you believe that that house would later be where my funeral would be held? Because that house became a funeral home, the mansion that I had erected. I would not describe what happened to me in the 1930s as ruin or that I was penniless. But I would definitely say it was a hard and humbling financial correction. What would make ours or my case different is that I had started from a height that virtually no Black family in America was ever permitted to reach in the first place. So the fall was a little longer and harder. Like I said, I died in 1967. I died of a hemorrhage. I was 65 years old. A seasoned woman. I did not have millions any longer. But I had instead what I think matters more in the long run, even as we chase wealth.
Which is?
I did have some working oil wells that still paid a modest income. I did have some real estate holdings in Kansas, but what I had was family. I had 3 sons, and by the time I died, 8 grandchildren. And they had not grown up in the glare of headlines, but rather in the nurturing, ordinary rhythm of Black middle-class life in Kansas City. There's something to be said for that. Because when you are hounded and only seen as a number, it can do a number on you.
Yeah.
My nieces from my sister Rosa, her daughters, they would say years later that I never behaved like a rich woman. In fact, my sister would say to them, yes, she has more things because she can afford it. But other than that, I did not put on airs. What my wealth actually became by the end is a story that has been told many times for many people. But my true wealth lay in a family that still saw me as a human being and not just as a number. After my cerebral hemorrhage and my subsequent death, that home, I don't know if it's still a funeral home, but at the time it was the C.K. Kerford Funeral Home. And after my homegoing services, I was carried back to Taft, Oklahoma, and I was buried in Blackjack Cemetery, not too far from where I was born, in the same modest plot of ground where generations of Creek Freedmen are buried. My own father, Joseph, was buried there. Mama Rosa was laid beside him in 1957, and then I joined them. That is where you will find me today, at least my remains. Not a mausoleum, not a monument built to the richest girl in the world, richest colored girl in the world, richest Negro girl in the world, but in a family plot in a Black town, down a narrow 1-lane road, among the people. So I say to all of you, we are still fighting for the right to our personhood. Today, people are again being asked to present their papers as proof for them to be treated humanely. For those of you who would find comfort in being an exception, think about your loved ones and even those you don't know who are denied that same personhood. And ask yourself, should you not fight, not just for yourself, but for all others? I declined being an honorary white. My life, my story also helped to bring about the creation of the NAACP's Children's Department, which was specifically to investigate white guardians suspected of exploiting Black and Indigenous children's estates. Are our organizations today still looking out for the most vulnerable? And here's what I will caution you all. Anytime it seems there is a story about a Black person, African American, African, Negro, colored person doing something or making something of their lives that white people don't think we quite deserve, then they must insert a white benefactor, a white savior.
True.
That is ongoing. And that is something that you all still need to be resisting and fighting and building up family that allows you to be seen always for your humanity. I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. One question before you go. You mentioned the issue of guardianship and the fact that regardless of who you choose, you might end up getting swindled, i.e. black guardianship, white guardianship. What was the state's way of deterring people from swindling those they were?
So, as the Black organizations in particular began to do these investigations and put pressure, some judges, like Judge Leahy, who I mentioned earlier, actually went legally after these swindlers. They had to provide their accounting, and they needed to show what came in and where the money still was or where it had been invested. And there were many cases where, particularly under Judge Leahy, but there were other judges as well, people were disbarred, people were fined, people were actually imprisoned until they could repay what they had stolen. So there were some measures, but someone had to sound the alarm. And then, of course, you had to go before a judge who was actually willing to hold these guardians accountable.
Oh, okay.
That was not always the case that they would. Sometimes they were in cahoots, but Judge Leahy is an example of one who did right by the Indian and Negro children in that respect.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, to our audience, you've been listening to Sarah Rector's story with regards to how she came to be, as they would say, in money, what happened to the money, how it was impacted by the Great Depression, and subsequently, as we all do, go back to ancestors. And again, this is what we do here. If this is your first time here, considering subscribing to the channel, because every week, we bring you a new story. Next week, it will be the turn of Queen Nandi. Who she is, what she's about, we'll all find out in the course of next week. Again, to Sarah Rector, we have to say thank you. And any final thoughts?
One thing that comes to mind is sometimes the exploitation is not just from outside. So parents, family, maybe this is not the right forum to say this, but when poverty and maybe also some poor decisions put you in a tough financial situation, do not mortgage your children's future. So maybe taking out a credit card in the name of a young adult who is unaware. Or some people even put their utilities in the names of their children, but then run up a bill that child is then legally responsible for when they become of age.
Yeah.
Other ways that rather than shepherding our children, we too might see them as a means to an end. I bring this up because having experienced the heights of wealth, but also the hardships from losing a great deal of that wealth, I understand how capitalism can become a virus that infects us all and clouds our ability to see each other as human beings, not just as a means to an end, a dollar bill, or a number like I was labeled. So even we, maybe even especially we, because we have been so deprived and oppressed for so long, need to make sure that we don't inadvertently take on the mindset, people who always put material things above a person's life. That is essentially the story of the United States of America. The land theft, the enslavement of people, the trail of tears, the breaking of treaties. It's always a money grab. May we not fall into the same traps for our own sakes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that final thought, it's good night. Thank you all for coming, and see you next week when it will be the turn of Queen Nandi. Until next week, it's good night and God bless. That is it for this episode of Women and Resistance. Thank you for joining us in amplifying the voices of women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. Be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. Together, remember, we honor the past, act in the present, and shape the future. Until next time, stay inspired and stay in resistance.